I'm not exaggerating when I say this is one of the biggest wins for Uber drivers and Lyft drivers ever. Uber and Lyft now required to pay Massachusetts rideshare drivers $32 an hour, $32 an hour, and drivers will get benefits too, but will still be independent contractors. There's a lot to unpack, even in those two sentences. But let's get into the article. And you can start here. That rideshare drivers in Massachusetts. So unfortunately, I know from a lot of people watching it, they're like, Mark, I'm not in Mass. Like, why would I care? You should, which I'll talk about a little bit later in this video. Rideshare drivers in Massachusetts will soon get company-provided benefits, as well as a minimum pay of $32.50 an hour, starting on August 15th, and it's thanks to a new settlement between the state and rideshare companies Uber and Lyft 4 years after Attorney General sued the companies, asserting that their drivers ought to be considered employees under state law. In addition, the two companies also agreed to pay a combined $175 million, which will be paid out to the current and former drivers who are underpaid by the companies. I also wonder, too, if I could get any of that. I mean, I doubt it. I mean, I hadn't driven in years, but you never know. That'd be kind of crazy if they're like, hey, you drove years ago in like 2015 or 16, you know. They will release, as you can see here, details about who qualifies to apply the next upcoming weeks. But here's the big thing, though. Going to like what I think is the best part. Drivers in the state will get yearly inflation-based pay raises and other employee-style benefits. That is the first time I've ever seen this, because one thing I've talked about when it comes to Uber and Lyft is that years ago, when I first started driving, the average amount was $20 to $25 an hour. And at that time, that wasn't bad. Now, though, that $20 to $25 an hour doesn't hit the same way. And now, 10 years later from when I first started driving, when people ask me how much does the average driver make, I say $20 to $25 an hour. So the amount that Uber drivers have been making is not adjusted for inflation. If anything, drivers now are making less than before, even though inflation's gotten worse, right? Which is not good. Definitely not good. So that they have that. And then in addition, they're able to earn up to 40 hours of sick leave a year paid at $20 an hour. I don't think I've ever heard that for any independent contractor job. In addition, Uber and Lyft will also give drivers stipends so they can buy healthcare and sign up for the state's family and medical leave program, and will cover work-related injuries. And here, to ensure they're complying with the agreement, the companies have to carry out annual audits and submit reports to the Attorney General's office. Punishment for violations could include any applicable reinstitution, fines, and penalties according to the published settlement. Now, like I said in the intro of this video, this, I think, is the best news I've ever heard for drivers. And I'm not exaggerating that. I'm not just saying that as clickbait or whatever. But as you can see pretty quickly from this article, and I kind of like that this article was like straight to the point about what was going on, the benefits, etc. There is a massive amount of stuff to unpack here. One, starting with something that wasn't mentioned as directly in the article. I kind of wish they did bring this up, but I think they just want to give you the facts. Uber and Lyft is still in Massachusetts. Let's start there. The whole issue going on with Minneapolis of Uber and Lyft saying they're going to leave, but that they didn't, and now they're pushing it back. All this kind of stuff going in Minneapolis, like I've talked about in a bunch of news videos. And I know I haven't really covered any news stuff in the Uber and Lyft world in a while. I uploaded like a bunch of tutorials recently. But everything that's going on with that, a big thing that Uber and Lyft does, in case you didn't know, is that let's say if a state wants to pass something like this that I just showed you, a lot of times Uber and Lyft says, you know what? We don't like it. We're going to leave if you do. They kind of play this cat and mouse game of we're going to leave, and it's super annoying, super frustrating. Uber and Lyft says, oh, we're sorry, we can't afford it. You know, all this kind of stuff. But in this case, Uber and Lyft is still in Massachusetts. And this is still happening in Massachusetts, or it's going to, on August 15th, at least at the exact time this video is about like a month and a half away. That is amazing. So one, starting with, I think something that the article didn't really touch upon, but I get it, I think because they're just trying to state the facts. Uber and Lyft is still in Massachusetts, yet the drivers are still getting these benefits. Second thing, like I've talked about in a lot of videos, what's going on with ride sharing is very interesting because I feel like ride sharing and rideshare drivers, Uber and Lyft drivers, and other rideshare driving companies are in this own category. I personally used to think drivers should be employees. I then changed my stance, so I think drivers should stay as independent contractors, as they are, but there should be some middle area. I think that, if you look at a lot of what's going on in the legal stuff, like here in California with AB5 and like say Prop 22, drivers are in this unique category where they're independent contractors with benefits. Typically, again, in case you didn't know, employees get a ton of benefits as part of being an employee. Independent contractors, typically you don't. But with ride sharing, you could argue very easily that rideshare drivers are independent contractors You could also very easily argue that rideshare drivers are employees. It's very easy to argue both sides. I can see very valid arguments on both sides. And what this tells me is that ride-sharing isn't kind of a unique category. Ride-sharing is really the only industry that when something happens regarding the independent contractor world or employee world or whatever, it's always the exception to the rule. There's always this asterisk on that bill or on this thing that they're putting forward or whatever. And so what I've said is it's kind of like, I know it's a weird analogy, but I feel like it makes sense. Like, it's like being an employee is like being in a relationship. Being an independent contractor is kind of like being single. And then you're like friends with benefits, right? In this case, I almost look at this as independent contractor with benefits. And I've said that in a bunch of videos over the past couple of years that I think ride-sharing is kind of its own category. Most jobs are employees. The rest of the jobs, you're independent contractors. I think Lyft and Uber drivers and rideshare drivers are the only ones in this unique thing that kind of fit both. It's kind of a combination of both. And as a result of that, they should be getting benefits and not just typical independent contractor treatment, if that makes sense. And this is happening. So second thing I want to say is that they are now, in Massachusetts, technically independent contractor with benefits. Third thing is just the benefits themselves. Paid sick leave. The fact that, they're kind of cracking down aggressive on Uber Lyft. Of course, the minimum wage that's also now adjusted for inflation. I mean, the list goes on and on. And this is crazy. I mean, even things like if you get hurt. I mean, the fact that there's some type of stipend when it comes to health insurance. I mean, these are things that are typically only reserved for employees. The list of benefits that the drivers are getting now in Massachusetts makes, in my opinion, Massachusetts maybe the best state to drive for in the country. It is tough to say, right? Because there are other states, take here in California, for example, that even though they might not get as many benefits, you might still make more money. So when you do all the math out, maybe it does actually equal out to be a driver in California as opposed to Massachusetts. But this is big. And that's the third big thing I want to say is that here in California, it was like, oh, well, they get a minimum wage, but it's not that good. Every driver, unfortunately, in California knows that. There was kind of like they said, oh, we're going to give you a minimum hourly guarantee, but it's super low. That's a decent one in Massachusetts. And I know there is some debate about passive time versus active time. Bit of a discussion for a different video, but even still, that is huge when it comes to this. That the state of Massachusetts, I think probably more than any other state, and I have to think about this because I've done a bunch of article reviews on this channel. I've read easily over 1,000 articles, easily, about Lyft and Uber. Some of them I've done a video about, some of them I haven't. But a big thing is that a lot of states kind of fall to the mercy of Uber and Lyft, and a lot of areas do, where Uber Lyft kind of has the power. This is the first time I've ever seen, and I hate to say it like this, but I've ever seen a state or a legislative body, if I call it that, or government, kind of stick it to Uber and Lyft. They pretty much just crushed it in a really positive way to support all the drivers. And I think that's a big thing that I hope, going down to the fourth point I want to say, this recap of this article, is, well, what about you? Because, of course, for Massachusetts drivers out there, you're probably like, this is the greatest thing that could have possibly happened, right? And for a lot of drivers in Massachusetts, I mean, this is awesome, right? But for the 49 other states, or let's say if you live in a different country, but also talking about America here, because it gets really tricky if you talk about international stuff. But for the states, for the 49 other states, what should you think about this? I'd be excited. I think this is the first time I've genuinely seen a state stick it to Uber and Lyft this aggressively. And I stress that word aggressively, whether it's back pay, the benefits, the audits they've done, the reports, they've very aggressively and directly targeted Uber and Lyft and won and made them do this. And Uber and Lyft is not leaving. They now have to deal with this. And there's a couple things that does come into my mind. Because on one end, I will say, I know Massachusetts is one of the top states for ride sharing. If you look at Massachusetts, New York, California, or some of the top ones, there's a few other ones out there, maybe Illinois. So when it comes to ride sharing, I will say that Massachusetts could be a very different be a very different issue in climate and culture and economy than, say, Iowa, for example, which might not have the ride-sharing hub that it does. As you can imagine, with ride-sharing being so popular in Massachusetts, it makes sense that maybe Uber and Lyft could be able to make this work. However, in Iowa, for example, where, say, there's too many drivers on the road now, excuse me, there's too many drivers on the road now. I've talked about this before in other videos. And again, I'm talking about pros and cons here. But there's too many drivers on the road. There's more drivers now than ever before, which means you have to pay all these drivers the amount that they should be getting paid and give them coverage. That gets tricky if like you're in an area that has way more drivers than people ordering it. Take like again like a very like maybe not as popular area like Iowa. In Massachusetts, that gap is a little closer, where there's a good amount of drivers, but there's also tons of people taking Ubers and Lyfts. So Uber and Lyft probably says, hey, you know what? We're not happy about this bill, of course, and this new law and legislation, but you know what? We're going to have to deal with it, one. But two, we can make it work. But in a very remote area or quiet area, that gets a little trickier. So I do get that perspective on one end. But on the other end, again, for the other 49 states, talking about the positive now, remember, states look at what other states are doing. And this is something I've talked about in other videos. Even other articles have mentioned it. Some state sees what another state's doing. They're like, hey, they just made their drivers independent contractor with benefits. They just stuck it to Uber and Lyft. And now this is what's happening. Maybe we should do the same. And so I do want to say that typically things do cause a ripple effect around the country. You know, like take that Massachusetts was the first state to legalize gay marriage, for example. I know very different subject for different video, but I think that's awesome. And the fact that now, look at what happened from state to state to then a federal thing. Likewise, I mean, obviously two very different topics, but I could see a lot of states following suit with this, at least I hope, because I've never seen a state just not only be this aggressive and stick it to Uber and Lyft like this, but also win. Like there was very little, I don't say it wasn't a contest per se, but like it was a clear win from the state with no questions asked. And now Uber Lyft has to deal with these new rules. And I think this does set, probably in my opinion, the biggest standard, at least that I've seen, when it comes to the benefits that drivers should get in terms of the inflation, in terms of the minimum wage, being adjusted for inflation, the fact of paid sick leave, the stipends. I mean, the list goes on and on. This is massive. And I think that this is something that gets me really happy for all the drivers, especially the ones in Massachusetts. And I think this is something that could definitely follow suit for the rest of the country. Because something like this has not really happened to this gravity. Obviously, states have won certain things, but usually, in some way, shape, and form, Uber and Lyft usually generally does come out on top. Even here in California, where drivers, like I said, had to get a minimum wage or now had to get some type of benefits or whatever, Uber and Lyft still, when you looked at everything, still came out on top after Prop 22. They still did. And a lot of drivers even said, you know, I'm not going to lie, Uber and Lyft kind of won that one. And again, subject for a different video, but the main overarching theme is that no matter what, when something like this happens, typically, I think 99% of the time, Uber and Lyft ends up skating away on top, paying drivers what they should be getting paid, or excuse me, should not be getting paid, and they pay them what they should get paid from their eyes, in the sense that they don't get paid that much at all. And now for the first time, a state's, in my opinion, won. This is like one of the few cases, if not the only case I've ever seen, where not only did a state win against Uber and Lyft to create new laws and rules and benefits, but they won this extreme to do all this new stuff now, and now this checks and balances in place, like I also talked about in the article. I mean, just overall, for numerous different reasons, this is one of the best news stories I've seen about ride sharing ever.